Hi, this is Chris Micheli, an adjunct professor at McGeorge School of Law, and today's podcast is on lobbying the floors of the California Legislature. And joining me on this podcast are my colleagues, fellow lawyers and lobbyists, Rob Moutrie and Laura Curtis. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Sure. So let's start off right off the top with some compare and contrast before we get into the gory details of lobbying the Assembly and Senate floors. What's a difference or two between lobbying a policy committee versus lobbying the floor? Rob?
I'm going to assume that everyone watched your high quality podcast on lobbying committees as background. But generally speaking, I would say that
it was really because of the featured guests, but that's just
the guests on there, which were not Laura and I, were wonderful. So I would say that lobbying the floor versus the committee is everything is slightly less detailed, faster, and more chaotic because there are more people to lobby. They are voting on more bills, right? And they have less time to become knowledgeable about your bill, right? Like most things in most games and most game theory kind of situations and lobbying, it's all shaped by the rules. So like I said, by the time you get to the floor, they have a lot of bills to vote on very quickly. They have very little time to learn about them. And they're more likely to be outside of the policy areas than the committee members, right? If you're in a committee and you're labor, you hear these bills all the time. Once you get to the floor, these people aren't even, pseudo experts in labor, right? So I think that's kind of the big things. You're going to have to step back your perspective to a more general pitch, more soundbitey generally. And you have to do more meetings faster with people who don't know. I think that's the big picture changes.
Rob, give us a flavor for the size differences, the number on the floors versus some of those committees that you are lobbying beforehand. Like you said, a labor committee, for example. I mean, what are we talking about in terms of some of these Senate and Assembly committee sizes versus the floors?
Right. Well, Laura would be the best expert to speak on labor committee, but broadly speaking, right, a committee would be somewhere between 5 and 10 people, and when you get to the floors, Senate is 40 and Assembly is 80. So you have many
a very small number really that you've hit in the committee versus on the floor.
Oh yes, and that's why with the committee you can really work through in detail and have a long talk and kind of lobby, meet with those people really. Everyone on the committee multiple times. You have that opportunity depending on the number of bills you're focused on. Okay. Once you get to the floor, you're still going to meet multiple times, but it's and I'm sure you'll ask a follow-up question here, so I should stop and give Laura a second. But it's the approach gets a little more shotgun.
Well, we definitely want to get into the details, but as a preliminary item, I definitely wanted to explore some of those differences. And let me turn to the other side of the coin with you, Laura. And so what's a similarity or two between lobbying policy committees in the legislature versus lobbying the floors?
Yeah. So, it goes back to the education piece. The individuals don't have as much time to delve into the issue. And so it sounds kind of corny, but a lot of times I will practice with family members to say, hey, this is, what I'm trying to explain. Does that make sense to someone who doesn't know this issue area? Because this is the time of the year that I feel the worst for staff because they have to be generalist on everything. They have to recommend votes to their bosses on everything. And so they really have to know what the issues are because their boss is going to ask questions too. And so you want to be able to educate them as well. So they have those answers in the back pocket, but it's so quick and they don't have as much time. And so you want to educate them, but at a high level, make sure that you're arming them with the information that they're going to need when their boss pushes back on the vote recommendation that they have. Because the staff is going to have a recommendation to their boss for how they think their boss should vote. And that's not only looking at the policy, it's also looking at, kind of the PR side of things and how this is going to play out and taking all that into consideration for how their constituents are going to feel about how they vote on an issue.
Now, you mentioned or you raised the issue of talking to committee members sometimes multiple times. I guess both of you actually made that point. Does that mean when you're lobbying the floor, you only get one opportunity? So is it once or multiple times when you hit the floors?
Yeah. Go ahead, Laura.
Multiple?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, multiple times. It depends on if you've met with them before and if they're a key target for who you need to get a vote and who you need to help sway your side. So if it's a key member of the legislature that you need to be persuasive, then you're going to follow up with them multiple times. Plus, things change very quickly. As soon as you're in a meeting and leaving a meeting, someone else from the other side is probably going back in and following up with them again. So you just need to, you don't want to hound them to the point where you become obnoxious, but you do want to make sure that you continue to follow up. So if they do have any questions, or if the other side raised other issues that are potentially persuasive, that you want to make sure you get those questions answered.
So Rob, is it the nature of the process then, as Laura seems to indicate, that because other lobbyists on the other side will be approaching those same legislators and staff that you've just approached, does that in itself require multiple visits, or does the sheer volume, you mentioned 40 Senate offices and 80 assembly offices, it seems like a pretty daunting task. Do you really have the time and ability to see all those offices more than once?
It depends, as Laura said. The first thing is to say that depending on the number of bills you're engaged in, right, your time is an issue, and the amount of time left for you to address this bill, but putting that aside, I think if we're looking for kind of a how-to approach, or what are the factors, I think you need to start, I think of it like a funnel, right? You're going to make at least one pass with just about everyone. But as you make that first pass, you're going to learn a lot of information. And it's an iterative process after that, right? You're going to learn, you'll give them your initial pitch. You should, of course, have your informational materials with you, right? And we may talk about that later, like what to bring. But you want to have your stuff with you. You make that first pass. You want to have a vote card and take notes. What did they ask? What is their bosses? If you're talking to the member directly, which you usually aren't in your initial visit, but you may be, if it's a staff member, what do they think their boss's concerns would be? Which way their boss is leaning? Have they talked to their boss yet? Right? You're going to get a bunch of information that helps you shape your next round of visits. And some will just tell you, there's no way my boss is voting for that, or my boss is 100% on board. Great, you can put them aside. If someone voted a certain way in committee previously, you can kind of put them aside. That people are loath to change positions on something, but unless they express concerns in committee saying, fix this or I won't, but you can put them in a category. And as you're putting these groups aside, you can iterate down to the people who you're like, okay, these people need more visits, right? Did the staff say, I haven't talked to my member, I don't know how they'll be, they have concerns, but they're not sure. Those are all triggers to say, okay, these people are on the list of people I got to go back and hit again. And then there's also, oftentimes the party plays into this. If you know that this is an issue where Republicans on a long-standing position feel X and Democrats feel Y, that may also shape who you're going to hit again and again. But it really is an iterative process where as you make multiple rounds, you isolate more and more who are the swing votes, right? Who is actually changeable. And then you'll be hitting them more and more. But it's not, as you indicated, Chris, it's shaped by the time, right? What is possible? Who is the most value for you to touch? Who is likely to change? And also your knowledge of legislators. If you're a first timer doing this, you don't have a knowledge of the person's personality as much. As you know really well, Chris, certain legislators are prone to never telling you how they're going to vote. They just are never going to express that. Doesn't matter if they know, they're never going to tell you. Certain others will tell you up front and just say, yeah, my boss is like this.
Those kind of like judges. I'll take it under advisement.
Yes, right. I'll take it under advisement, or thanks for your thoughts on this. But the ones you appreciate are the legislators and staff who are up front. And they'll just say, listen, here's where my boss is. If it changes, I will tell you. You can come back and talk to me. Those ones you can put aside. One funny story, Chris, you were there for that, but on one bill a couple of years ago, I had a legislative staffer who said, listen, my boss is here on this. If you bug me again, we will have issues. And that's great. You've done your job. They know where you are. It's not going to get better, right? That's all you can get. So yeah, it's very iterative and more like a funnel, I would say.
Let me ask this question. Since at this point, when the bill reaches the floor, you've obviously testified before a committee and obviously lobbied those committee members. And if the bill had a second policy committee hearing, if it were a dual referred bill, or at the fiscal committee, you may be lucky to get in a few words there. Does your committee pitch, in other words, your elevator spiel or your office visit explanation of your position on the bill when it's before committee, does that change at all when the bill hits the floor? Does it get shorter? Does it get longer? Or is it essentially the same pitch that you made, maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago in the policy committee?
For me, it changes just because, again, it's more of a general, I'm trying to break it down into more easily digestible information, basically, in these kind of circumstances. Because again, the staffers have to be generalists. They're not going to be experts in this area. You can't necessarily refer to, one court case and expect that they know what that means. And so I try to just, make it as simplistic as possible while providing the information. But again, it depends on how engaged the staff is and how much they want to know about the issue. And the one other point that I would make on the previous question was you don't want to assume anything about how a member will vote. There's been often times where I thought, no, I'm not going to go by that office. I don't think this is something that they're really going to care about or have, going to be on our side on. And surprisingly, every individual member is an individual and they care about different issues. And so if you have the time and can, you do want to try to at least check in with each office once just to make sure that the issue is raised with them.
So you're obviously indicating there are some modifications to be made between your committee pitch and your floor pitch. Let me ask specifically on this point, Rob, if I could, how do you deal with opposition on the floor? In other words, do you address it? Senator X, here are the 5 reasons my client supports this bill. And then you might hear from the opposition that they say the following, or do you ignore the opposition? Do you wait to be asked about the opposition or what might the other side say? How do you handle that?
Yes, you absolutely want to be able to address the opposition's points. You want to be ready to. I never think it's a good storytelling or, convincing policy to walk in and address their points first, right? You want to tell your proactive story. And you want to, as Laura said, in a shorter, more condensed version. You're more prone to analogies and more prone to kind of simpler statements. Remember, the staffers aren't lawyers. If you're McGeorge students watching this, right, you kind of take for granted that everyone's a lawyer and knows, but none of these people may be. And yeah, opposition, you absolutely want to take their points into account and know them because you're going to get asked. Staffers or members will say, well, opposition said this to me, and that seems really concerning for my district. So you want to be able to say, no, that's not a real issue for you. And we haven't mentioned this, but when you get to the floor, you really want to be about districts more than about the policy, details. What is the district of this person? Is it rural? Is it urban? What's there? What businesses are there? What groups are there? Because they're going to all think, how does this affect my district? And it's very personal in that way. It's not a general policy discussion.
Let me turn to this. Do you handle meetings differently? One more question on this topic. Do you handle meetings differently when you're dealing with supporters versus likely opponents of the bill and even the undecided? Or again, is your pitch substantially the same regardless? In other words, would you handle a meeting with a legislator whose staff has clearly said, yeah, my boss hasn't decided, or my boss is leaning no? Is that different than, yeah, my boss will probably support it, but it would be helpful for you to talk to her?
Yes, you handle them differently, right? Support staff, if you're someone who tends to be on your side, you can speak to them and say, hey, just a check-in visit is nice. Are we still good? Any changes with your member? Or they may even actively want to help you, just say, hey, can you talk to your colleagues on this? Can you talk to, if someone who they're friends with is having a maybe position, then, hey, can you talk to, your colleague, this other assembly person who is hanging right now? And can your boss maybe explain to them the benefits? If it's opponents, right, you want to be respectful and you need to be more ready to address the opposing points, right? But the one thing I would stress above all is you want to be respectful of their position and their time. Because you may need their votes for something else. And you don't want to be a kind of scorched earth person on this one and get upset with them because you need to be able to talk to them professionally in the future. So respect is, I think, the number one thing that's the common thread amongst them.
Good point. Laura, let me ask you this question. Both you and Rob have a lot of experience in leading lobbying coalitions, multiple groups, advocating in support or opposition. What do you think is a more effective approach? Individual lobby visits where you or Rob walks in versus coalition meetings where maybe a half a dozen, even a dozen different groups or individuals come in and hold a meeting with a legislator and his or her staff?
Yeah, if I have time and it's more, a little bit ahead of floor, then I'll try to do an individual visit just to give them the groundwork, or lay the groundwork for what the bill is about and take a little time to educate them. But the coalition visits are great because you can utilize it as not only a show of how many people are concerned about it, but also as a show of how much you respect their time. And we don't want 12 people, separately making meetings and having to utilize your and your boss's time in order to express our concerns. So we're all going to come together and have one meeting where everyone can quickly address those issues. So the coalition meetings, I think, can be extremely effective because it really is a showing of how people feel about the issue and how many people are concerned or in support of an issue and why. But again, if you need time to really walk them through it, if it's a big issue, a big bill, and they should have more information on it, then I will do that initially just to ensure that that I have time with them to speak with them about all the concerns or the support for the issue.
So I think it depends a lot on the people in the coalition and the members. Some members, will like a big meeting. You can see that they're influenced by a large group being there. Also, it depends on how well-spoken your coalition members are and how different the perspectives are, right? I've had some bills where you bring a very different perspective. For example, I've lobbied on behalf of the business community. If I have public entities in the coalition, cities, counties, those kind of people, I think it's effective to have them go separately because they're really raising different concerns about the issue. And you want the legislator to feel that it's not just one group that's all homogenous with these concerns. There are a variety. It also depends because sometimes if my coalition members, I think, aren't as well spoken or knowledgeable, I don't want them going in alone, right? I want them in a coalition meeting where we can keep on message.
Makes sense. Laura, let's conclude on this point if we could. Rob alluded to it earlier in our conversation, but as you make these rounds with all the members of the Senate and Assembly on a bill, what things do you bring to that meeting? Do you have to carry copies of the bill and your letters and a vote card and everything else, or is it more streamlined?
I have a very large purse. So usually what I'm handing them is what has been created as a floor alert, just a simple document with bullet points that highlight the biggest reasons to support the issue or the biggest reasons to oppose it. I will also have a copy of the letter if we have a coalition letter or an individual letter on the bill. And then sometimes a copy of the bill or any other kind of news or press release that's out there about the issue, really anything that's helpful. And then it depends on the meeting and it depends on where the member is on the issue. If I give them all of it, I at least give them the floor alert. And then sometimes I'll provide the follow-up documentation. But I don't want to walk in and hand them 10 different items a day before the boss has to vote on it because they're just not going to read it and it's just going to be annoying. So it just depends on the timing of it all.
Very helpful guidance. Well, I want to thank both of you for joining me, and I hope our listeners and viewers have found it educational to hear some of the issues that lobbyists address when they are lobbying bills on the floors of the California State Legislature. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks so much. Chris.